sermon that's been prepared by the Reverend Ashley Harness. And this sermon in this whole service has been delivered to all of the UCC churches in the state and is to be used as the service for today. The same service, the same sermon is being delivered at the conference itself in St. Joseph. So today we're going to talk about how do we really wrestle with love. This morning as we worship here in this place, our friends at the Minnesota Conference of the United Church of Christ and our pastor Lawrence Snell and our delegates Nancy Barber, Nancy Carpenter, Cheryl Rempel, and Katie Avantries are gathered in St. Joseph for that annual meeting. Even though we are separated by distance, we are together in spirit. One way we are manifesting that connection is that we're using a sermon that is being preached across the conference this morning. It is based on the scripture and has been used at the annual conference as well. These words are not mine again. They are written by the Reverend Ashley Harness of the Lindale UCC in Minneapolis. I share them with you in the spirit of connection with our UCC kindred, and I pray I will speak her words and God's word with integrity. This scripture story of Jacob wrestling with the angel is one of the most beautiful and rich stories of our tradition. Because of this, it also is a little daunting to preach on. It is so famous and so beloved that it feels almost off limits. But if we take some time and study what others, especially well-respected theologians, have said about it in the past, we might notice some themes that emerge. We could categorize them this way. A, theological sports commentary. This is a strain of analysis focused on tactical blow-by-blow and obsessed with the question of who won the wrestling match. And B, what we might call a scientific classification of God and the divine figures debate. Is this mysterious figure who Jacob meets an angel, a demon, a man with divine attributes? That's one commentary. That's what one commentary called it, as though making some kind of scientific point about levels of God concentrated in this figure. Finally, C, the is it supposed to be real line of questions. Is this a dream, a sequence, an analogy for Jacob's psychological wrestling, or supposedly a real encounter with the real physical world? Though these lines of questioning are interesting, they may not offer us very much to really take home. The last one, though, does remind Pastor Harness of one of her favorite lines from the Harry Potter series. When Harry's soul lingers in space between death and life after he has faced Voldemort in the conversation in the last book, he meets the spirit of Dumbledore. Harry asks Dumbledore if the conversation they're having is real or if it's just happening in his head. Dumbledore responds, "Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it's not real?" For her, the answers of that line of questioning were quite well. As for the other two themes, theological sports commentary and scientific classification of God, those may reveal more about these particular theologians' anxieties around power, both human and divine, than about what the text really has to tell us about the relational encounter at the core of the story, the blessing. They seem more focused on making sense out of the story than in finding a meaning in it. Looking further among some of the more recent, though still powerful meaning makers of our time, we can find another theme. God's power is not about control, something we can measure by who wins. God's power is the power of persistent love, not saccharine, glossy, hallmark love. As Catherine Keller describes it, this love is the unconditional radiance that embraces neighbor, stranger, or even enemy. It lures us to notice our interdependence and implicates us in the lives of others. This is the divine power of love that I think Jacob encounters in our story for today. Let us back up for a moment to remember Jacob's context here. First, remember Jacob is not exactly Mr. Righteous. He stole his brother Esau's birthright and blessing from their father. Big deals in ancient times. This is the kind of finagling a way to steal your brother's college fund and inherits and future prospects for security and status in the world all at one time. Not cute. Esau is furious. So Jacob's mother sends Jacob to live with an uncle to avoid Esau's rage and revenge. Over the next 20 years, Jacob grows. He grows up. He turns his childhood trickster skills into the adult workplace strengths, so to speak. He's prosperous as he has 2 wives, 2 maids, and 11 children are meant to show us. So of course, this is when God decides it's time for Jacob to go back to his homeland and face that past. On his journey, he will have to pass through the land where his estranged brother Esau lives, girded by wealth and an army. And he is terrified about being rejected. I don't mean emotionally rejected. He's afraid Esau's people might kill him before he can even talk to Esau. The night before he will pass through Esau's land is when we meet Jacob in our text today. I want to pause and point out something about this story. In order for Jacob to become the person, the leader he's supposed to be, God sends him back to his homeland to face his past. God sends him back to the place where he cheated, and he lied, and he stole. He had to make it right before he could go forward. And in order to be ready to make it right, he had to wrestle mightily. What in your past or your families are you being called to turn around and face into? How is God calling this community to engage the truth about who we've been? Now let's read this story again with this context, with our own lives as the background. But this time with a bit different translation of a few of the words and a new theological lens reflected by my reading and praying. Jacob was left alone and the force of love wrestled with him until daybreak. When this glimmer of love incarnate saw Jacob could endure its presence, love grew, persisting to reach Jacob where he was most vulnerable. Then the power of love's embrace had done it, when the power of love's embrace had done its work and said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So love paused and said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob," the one whose name means he grasps for what is not his. Love responded, "Now you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, the name for one who strives with love and endures." Then Jacob asked, "Please, tell me your name." And love said, "Why is it that you try to grasp me still?" And then in there, love blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, which means face of love, saying, "For I have seen love face to face, and I have endured." The sun rose upon him as he left to meet Esau, forever moving slowly because love left a mark on his core. What is wonderful about this text, both the original and the new translation, is how honest it is about real life blessings. Jacob says, "For I have seen love," for God, and face to face and endured. While we can imagine Jacob awestruck and joyous that the word endured speaks pretty loudly. Another translation of that root word in Hebrew is survived. We don't usually talk about surviving a blessing. But isn't that so true sometimes? Just think about it for a moment. For the Reverend Ashley Harness, thinking about her grandmother Flo, that she certainly encountered the face of love in her. On the day of her funeral, she didn't necessarily feel like she was receiving a blessing. She didn't have the language for it at the time. But in retrospect, she was surviving the blessing of her life. Radiant, real, persistent love that can be painful because it is precious. Isn't that why we run away from encounters with love? Why we sometimes need love to tackle us in the middle of the night, to reach in for that place where we are most vulnerable? Isn't that why we can't get entangled in wrestling matches with love? At times pulling it close, at times grasping, at times pushing it away with all our might. But imagine how many more blessings we might count if we could each encounter with love as a blessing, no matter the outcome, no matter if it is painful. In Jacob's case, he survives with a limp, forever marked to move more slowly. This is the opposite of what we associate with blessings. Instead of protection and health, God's blessing here makes Jacob's vulnerability very visible. And yet this vulnerability, he discovers, is a different kind of power. When Jacob continues on his journey to meet his brother, his enemy, in the next chapter of Genesis, he doesn't go forward in attack mode or as a trickster. Even though his first glimpse of Esau is with him surrounded by 400 soldiers, Jacob steps forward to greet him all alone, bows, not once, but 7 times, like a dog rolling over on his belly. To this, Esau responds with an embrace. And Jacob says to Esau, "To see your face is like seeing the face of God." This is the tremendous power of God's persistent love. An unconditional, radiant embrace, neighbor, to a stranger, or even an enemy. This whole story summarizes why we need church. Like those theologians we consider at the beginning of this sermon, it's easier for us to spend time in our heads categorizing and measuring and making sense than it is for us to go out into a moment of encounter, of blessing. Church, on the other hand, can be a place where we practice encountering love despite all of the risk. Church, at its best, is where we learn to endure blessings. Church, if we make it so, is where we too can transform our vulnerability into the power we need to heal this world. May we at the Federated Church, dearest Federated Church, for ourselves